In the late 1970s and 1980s, few religious figures in America commanded as much attention, wealth, and influence as Jim Bakker. He was not a quiet pastor serving a small congregation. He was a media mogul of faith, a man whose sermons traveled through television screens into millions of living rooms, whose smile radiated reassurance, and whose words promised both spiritual salvation and earthly prosperity. To his followers, Bakker was living proof that God rewarded faith with abundance. To his critics, he was the embodiment of excess. And to federal investigators, he would eventually become one of the most infamous examples of how belief, money, and unchecked power could collapse into criminal fraud. Jim Bakker's rise began humbly. Born in Michigan in 1940, he was drawn early to evangelism and broadcasting. He understood something that many traditional pastors did not yet grasp. Television could transform religion into spectacle. With his wife, Tammy Faye Bakker, Jim created the PTL Club, a Christian talk show that blended sermons, music, celebrity interviews, and emotional testimonies into a format that felt modern, intimate, and irresistible. Viewers were not just watching church, they felt like they were part of a family. As donations poured in, the ministry expanded beyond broadcasting. Bakker envisioned something grander, something that merged faith with leisure, devotion with luxury. That vision became Heritage USA, a sprawling Christian theme park and resort in South Carolina. It featured hotels, water parks, shopping villages, and entertainment venues, all framed as a wholesome alternative to secular vacation destinations. Bakker sold it as a place where families could enjoy rest and recreation while remaining close to God. To fund this dream, Bakker introduced a concept that would later become central to his downfall: lifetime partnerships. Viewers were told that for a fixed donation, often several $1,000s, they would receive annual lodging at Heritage USA for the rest of their lives. These partnerships were marketed as blessings, investments in God's work that would also reward the faithful materially. Millions of dollars flowed in from elderly couples, working-class families, and retirees who trusted Bakker not only as a preacher, but as a steward of their sacrifices. Behind the scenes, the reality was far less holy. Heritage USA was not financially sustainable at the scale Bakker promoted. The number of partnerships sold far exceeded the resort's capacity. Many of the promised benefits were mathematically impossible to fulfill. Funds raised for specific projects were diverted to cover debts, maintain appearances, and finance the lavish lifestyles of the ministry's leadership. Jim and Tammy Faye lived in luxury, with expensive homes, designer clothing, and extravagant personal expenses, all funded by donations given in faith. As long as the money kept flowing, the cracks were easy to hide. But scandals have a way of compounding, and in 1987, the first major rupture occurred. Reports emerged that Bakker had paid hush money to a former church secretary after a sexual encounter. The revelation shocked viewers who had seen him preach morality and righteousness. While sexual misconduct alone did not bring down the empire, it shattered the image of purity that protected it. Donations slowed. Scrutiny increased. Soon, journalists and rival religious leaders began asking deeper questions about PTL's finances. Investigative reports revealed that the lifetime partnerships were largely fictional promises. Thousands of donors were never able to redeem the benefits they had paid for. Many learned, too late, that their money had not been set aside as promised, but spent almost immediately. Federal authorities took notice. The investigation that followed was methodical and devastating. Prosecutors built a case showing that Bakker knowingly misrepresented the nature of the partnerships and the use of funds. They argued that he was not simply a poor manager or an overly ambitious dreamer, but someone who intentionally deceived donors to maintain his empire. Bakker maintained that he believed God would eventually provide the means to fulfill every promise. But the law does not recognize divine optimism as a defense against fraud. In 1989, Jim Bakker was convicted on multiple counts of mail fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy. The sentence shocked the nation: 45 years in federal prison and a $500,000 fine. Though the sentence was later reduced on appeal, the message was clear. A man who once preached from gilded pulpits would now sleep in a prison cell. For many of his followers, the verdict was devastating. Some felt betrayed, others confused, and a few still believed Bakker was being persecuted for his faith. But for countless donors, especially the elderly, who had given away savings they could not replace, the conviction confirmed a painful truth: trust had been exploited. Bakker entered prison, a disgraced figure, stripped of his empire and influence. Tammy Faye divorced him, and PTL collapsed, leaving behind abandoned buildings and broken promises. Heritage USA, once billed as a Christian utopia, became a symbol of excess and deception, its empty structures standing as monuments to ambition gone unchecked. After serving several years, Bakker was released from prison in the mid-1990s. He would later return to religious broadcasting, insisting he had repented and been forgiven. Yet his re-emergence sparked controversy, especially when he again solicited donations and promoted products under religious branding. To critics, it was proof that the cycle of faith and profit had never truly ended. To supporters, it was evidence of redemption. The legacy of Jim Bakker's crimes extends far beyond one man. His case forced a national reckoning with the financial accountability of religious organizations. It exposed how easily spiritual authority can disarm skepticism, how promises framed as divine can bypass rational scrutiny, and how the language of faith can be used to justify excess. From pulpit to palace, Jim Bakker built a kingdom that looked holy on the surface but was rotten at its core. And when it fell, it left behind a cautionary tale that still echoes through churches and airwaves today. Belief can inspire hope, but when it is mixed with unchecked power and money, it can become a weapon against the very people it claims to save. What part of this case shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments. In the quiet stretches of rural Tennessee, the town of Dyer County once felt like a place where people could breathe, work their farms, and sleep with doors unlocked. It was the kind of community where neighbors waved even if they didn't know your name, and where nothing ever truly changed. But in the late 1980s and early 1990s, something strange began to grow at the edges of that peaceful landscape. It started with whispers, the arrival of newcomers, and a church that seemed ordinary from the outside but carried a presence that unsettled longtime locals. The group called itself the Ministry of Christ Church, led by a man who walked into town with confidence, charisma, and a layered history that no one fully understood. His name was Tony Alamo, and soon, a significant part of the town would no longer feel like it belonged to itself. People in Dyer County first heard about the group through rumors passed around in barbershops, gas stations, and Friday night diners. Most dismissed the stories as exaggerations told by out-of-towners passing through, but the truth was that this religious organization had been expanding across several states, buying land, forming tight-knit communities, and setting up rules that grew increasingly strict. When they arrived in Tennessee, they settled into what had once been a sparsely populated area, giving the impression of a peaceful religious retreat. Yet what looked like devotion on the surface slowly revealed something darker. The Ministry of Christ Church began acquiring houses, farmland, and small businesses. Members pooled money, donated assets, and worked long hours to build what their leader promised would be a purified, holy community. Locals noticed that the newcomers rarely mingled with them, except when buying up properties or supplies. Many dressed modestly, spoke softly, and deferred to their leader with visible reverence. Outsiders were politely acknowledged but never truly invited inside their world. Soon, the group was large enough that its presence was impossible to ignore. Residents began referring to their settlement informally as Hononi Village, and although it was not incorporated as a town, the cult eventually controlled enough land and homes that it functioned like one. Tony Alamo had a reputation that followed him, even if people in Dyer County didn't know the full details at first. Before Tennessee, he had run operations in Arkansas and California, where accusations of abuse, coercion, and extremism had shadowed his name. But he also had loyal followers who believed he spoke the truth, who believed he was chosen to lead them through the coming end times he preached about. Every person who joined the commune fell deeper into a system where obedience was demanded, privacy disappeared, and questioning the leader became dangerous. Inside Hononi Village, life followed strict guidelines. Members worked without pay, contributing to the group's businesses, from clothing manufacturing to distribution shops. Children were homeschooled under the church's direction, and punishments were severe for those who resisted. Women had specific roles. Men were expected to labor long hours, and families were often separated so that loyalty to the leader remained unquestioned. Those who tried to leave were pressured, shamed, or threatened with losing access to their own children. Over time, the outside world began hearing reports from former members who had escaped, each sharing similar stories of isolation, emotional abuse, and forced labor. Local residents in Dyer County didn't immediately understand what was happening inside the compound, but they felt its influence spreading. The cult bought equipment from local stores, but always in cash. They purchased large amounts of food, supplies, and building materials. Their members appeared in town only in small groups, never alone, and more strangely, no one ever seemed to smile. Teenagers whispered about seeing trucks drive in late at night. Adults wondered why the group always traveled in pairs, as if someone was watching someone else. Most kept their distance, believing that whatever was happening behind the fences of Hononi village was best left alone. But silence eventually gave way to fear when stories began spilling out from those who escaped the cult's grip. Former members reached law enforcement first in other states, including Arkansas and California, describing horrific conditions under Tony Alamo's leadership. Some spoke of children being beaten, starved, or forced to work. Others described forced marriages between underage girls and older men, all arranged and approved by Alamo. These allegations slowly formed a picture of a man who had not just misled his followers, but had inflicted systematic abuse under the guise of religion. Authorities, now aware of the cult's expansion into Tennessee, began paying attention. The FBI and local law enforcement agencies started piecing together reports, financial irregularities, and testimonies. One of the most significant problems investigators faced was the cult's secrecy. Members rarely spoke to police, and those who wanted to leave often feared retaliation. But the weight of the allegations became too heavy to ignore. Law enforcement began surveillance, collecting evidence, and listening to the accounts of survivors who bravely stepped forward. Inside the compound, Tony Alamo continued to preach apocalyptic messages, often laced with fear and paranoia. He warned his members that the government was the enemy, that outsiders wanted to destroy them, and that anyone who left would face spiritual and physical danger. These messages tightened his control over the group and kept members isolated. The more pressure law enforcement applied from the outside, the more extreme his sermonizing became. Former members later recalled how the atmosphere grew tense, filled with dread, as if the community felt the walls closing in. In 1994, the situation escalated dramatically. Investigators, armed with testimonies and credible reports of severe abuse, raided properties associated with the ministry of Christ Church. The raids took place not only in Tennessee but across multiple states, targeting locations linked to Tony Alamo's operations. The Hononi village site in Tennessee was among the properties searched. What authorities found confirmed what survivors had been reporting: children living in harsh conditions, illegal labor practices, and evidence of physical abuse that aligned with the accounts of those who had escaped. The raid shook the town. Locals watched as law enforcement vehicles streamed in and out, as children were led away, and as members stood silently, offering no explanation. For many residents, it was the first time they realized how deeply the cult had embedded itself in their community. What had seemed like a strange but harmless religious group was revealed to be something far more sinister. The townspeople felt a mix of guilt for not looking closer and relief that authorities were finally intervening. After the raids, more survivors came forward, providing detailed accounts of life inside the cult. Some described how they had been forced to work long hours in the church's businesses without pay. Others shared stories of beatings carried out as punishment for minor infractions. The most disturbing testimonies came from underage girls who revealed that Tony Alamo had arranged marriages between them and older men, some as young as 12 or 13 years old. These were not merely rumors or they were first-hand accounts backed by evidence and corroborated by multiple survivors. The investigation continued for years, as authorities gathered more evidence to build a solid case. Tony Alamo fled from state to state for a period, evading arrest and continuing to preach to his followers through recorded messages and written letters. But eventually, the law caught up with him. He was arrested in 1994 for threatening a federal judge and various other charges, though he continued to maintain influence over some members even while incarcerated. His operations in Tennessee, Arkansas, and California slowly unraveled under the weight of legal scrutiny. In the years that followed, Tony Alamo faced additional charges. Former members filed civil suits, and federal prosecutors pursued criminal charges related to child abuse, forced labor, and the sexual exploitation of minors. The most devastating charges came in 2008, when he was convicted of transporting minors across state lines for sexual purposes. Several survivors testified in court, bravely recounting the abuse they had endured. Their testimonies were gripping, heartbreaking, and crucial to ensuring justice. Tony Alamo was sentenced to 175 years in federal prison, effectively a life sentence. For the residents of Dyer County, the trial brought a sense of closure, but also reflection. The cult's presence had changed the town in ways that would take years to heal. Properties once owned by the Ministry of Christ Church sat abandoned, overgrown with weeds and memories that locals preferred to forget. Some former members who had escaped or been removed during the raids settled quietly in nearby towns, trying to rebuild their lives. Others moved far away, seeking a fresh start. The once tight circle of cult members dispersed, leaving behind a legacy of pain but also resilience. The aftermath of the cult's control over parts of Dyer County left a lingering question. How could an entire community fall under the influence of one man? Survivors offered one answer. It happened slowly, through manipulation, isolation, and fear. People joined, seeking faith, healing, or direction, only to find themselves trapped in a system designed to break them down and build allegiance to their leader. The townspeople provided another perspective. The group's secrecy and self-containment made it easy for outsiders to assume everything was fine. The cult controlled enough land and homes to create their own world, one that didn't interact much with the town, except when necessary. In the years since Tony Alamo's conviction, documentaries, news, investigations, and survivor accounts have shed light on what happened inside Hononi village. They reveal a disturbing truth. Control can take many forms, and sometimes it builds quietly until it becomes a force that grips an entire community. Dyer County eventually reclaimed its peace, but the memory of those years still lingers, especially for those who witnessed the cult's presence firsthand. The case of the Ministry of Christ Church in Tennessee stands as a chilling reminder of how vulnerable towns can be when charismatic leaders exploit faith, fear, and isolation. For the survivors, their courage in speaking out helped dismantle a system of abuse that had once seemed impenetrable. For the town, the experience became a cautionary tale about vigilance, compassion, and listening to the quiet warning signs that something is wrong. And for anyone hearing this story today, it leaves behind a haunting question. How many other communities, right now, are being controlled by forces hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone brave enough to expose the truth? What part of this case shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments. In the wide, dusty deserts of Wasco County, Oregon, the town of Antelope once sat quietly as a forgotten dot on the American map, with barely a few dozen residents, a one-room school, and the kind of stillness that only remote land can create. It was a place where nothing changed for decades. Generations lived and died on the same dry soil, waving to the same faces and trusting the same neighbors. No one in Antelope imagined that their sleepy community would one day become the center of an international controversy, transformed into a battleground between local residents and one of the most powerful, well-funded cults in modern American history. But in the early 1980s, that is exactly what happened when followers of Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh descended on their land and began reshaping the town in their own image. The people of Antelope first noticed the newcomers in the spring of 1981. They arrived in caravans of buses, vans and trucks, wearing maroon and red clothing, and speaking with a kind of serene enthusiasm that the locals found unusual. At first, the residents shrugged it off. After all, outsiders sometimes passed through. But this group didn't just pass through. They purchased a sprawling 64,000-acre ranch just outside of town. They began calling it Rajneeshpuram, and they announced plans to build a full-scale commune. Homes, farms, dairies, airstrips, meditation halls, restaurants, and strangest of all, the largest spiritual city in the world. To the people of Antelope, this seemed surreal. Their entire population could fit inside a school gymnasium, while the group that had just arrived numbered in the thousands. The locals watched nervously as construction vehicles rumbled down their quiet roads, as newcomers dug irrigation channels and erected prefabricated buildings at a pace the town had never witnessed. They had money, organization, and a kind of unstoppable momentum. It soon became clear that they weren't just building a community, they were creating a world unto themselves. The leader of the movement, Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, did not appear in Antelope at first. He remained secluded in his private home within the commune, guarded and revered by his followers, but his presence hovered over everything they did. The real face of the operation became his spokeswoman and personal secretary, Ma Anand Sheila, a sharp-tongued, fiercely loyal woman who handled every detail of the group's expansion. Sheila was charismatic, confrontational, and utterly determined to protect and grow the guru's new empire. The first tension between Antelope residents and the Ragnishis began with zoning disputes. The commune required permits for thousands of people to live on land that had previously supported a few dozen cattle. When Wasco County hesitated, the Rajneeshis filed lawsuits, protested, and flooded local meetings with hundreds of followers clad in identical maroon outfits. To the townspeople, it felt like being overrun. Their small meetings, once attended by a handful of neighbors, became scenes of overwhelming intimidation. Soon the group set its sights on Antelope itself. They began buying properties inside the town, old houses, abandoned buildings, empty lots. They moved in dozens of followers. They opened shops, restaurants, and community spaces. One by one, the original residents watched as their neighbors sold their homes, some out of fear, some out of exhaustion, some because they simply didn't want to fight anymore. By 1982, Antelope was no longer the town its people knew. The Rajneeshis now controlled the majority of properties. They ran for seats on the city council and rapidly took over the local government. Their numbers dwarfed the remaining locals. Elections that once involved 15 to 20 ballots suddenly saw hundreds of votes cast by newcomers, wearing the same red robes. Within months, Antelope's governing board, fire department, and school district were dominated by Rajneesh followers. The new leaders changed policies, rewrote town laws, and even renamed the town. Antelope, the old western settlement, was renamed Rajneesh, the first American town ever taken over and rechristened by a cult. For the original residents, it was a nightmare that didn't seem real. The town they had spent their lives in no longer belonged to them. Many had to walk past security patrols staffed by Rajneesh followers, carrying radios and wearing uniforms. School children saw unfamiliar adults in red clothing standing at playground fences. Neighbors who once shared coffee now avoided eye contact. People whispered about leaving, but leaving meant abandoning generations of memories and giving up the fight. Outside the town, the commune grew more organized and more unsettling. It had its own police force, called the Peace Force, complete with badges, vehicles, and weapons. It operated its own medical services, businesses, and agricultural systems. It also had a reputation for harsh internal discipline. Members who disobeyed rules faced public humiliation, isolation, or forced labor. Those who tried to leave sometimes found themselves threatened or followed. Sheila, ever the strategist, realized that controlling Antelope was not enough. The group needed political power in Wasco County to secure its long-term survival, so she devised a plan that would later become one of the most infamous episodes in American cult history. The Rajneeshis began busing in thousands of homeless people from across the United States, offering them free food and shelter in exchange for joining the commune. The goal was simple: flood the county with new voters who would elect cult-friendly candidates. The group demanded identification documents, controlled the new arrivals movements, and attempted to register them in huge numbers. When this caused backlash, the cult allegedly drugged some of the homeless residents with Haldol to keep them compliant. But when that plan faltered, Sheila turned to something even more extreme. In 1984, the Rajneesh leadership carried out what is now recognized as the largest bioterror attack in U.S. history. They contaminated salad bars in the city of the Dalles with salmonella, sickening more than 750 people. Restaurants across the city saw customers fall violently, ill students, office workers, retirees, couples out for lunch. No one understood what was happening. The goal was to incapacitate enough voters to swing a county election in favor of the Rajneeshis. The attack shocked Oregon. Suddenly, this wasn't a strange group of spiritual outsiders. It was an organized faction willing to poison innocent people to gain power. State investigators, the Oregon State Police, and the FBI began looking closely at the commune. Surveillance increased, wiretaps were approved, and inside the commune, paranoia spread. Members later described how Sheila began stockpiling weapons, fortifying buildings, and preparing for what she believed was an imminent war with the government. Dissent grew within the cult as some followers questioned her extreme decisions. Eventually, a power struggle erupted. Sheila and several top lieutenants fled the country overnight, escaping first to Europe, then to other international safe houses. With Sheila gone, the commune began to collapse from the inside. New leaders stepped forward and publicly exposed the crimes she had committed in the guru's name. They shared details about wiretaps, poisoning plots, immigration scams, forced labor, and violent plans against critics. Authorities moved quickly. The FBI raided the commune, collecting evidence of the Salmonella attack, illegal wiretapping equipment, and documents outlining criminal conspiracies. Members were arrested. Those who had been too afraid to speak earlier now came forward with their own stories. Ma Annan Sheila was eventually found in West Germany, arrested, and extradited to the United States. She was convicted of attempted murder, assault, and a host of other charges, serving time in federal prison. Her top lieutenants received similar sentences. Rajneesh himself was charged with immigration fraud and deported from the United States. Rajneesh Pram died almost overnight. Buildings emptied out, buses left, farmland dried, houses that once held hundreds now sat silent. Meanwhile, the original residents of Antelope faced a different kind of devastation. Their town, once renamed Rajneesh, under cult control, had to rebuild everything from its legal charter to its population. Many of the pre-cult residents had already moved away, exhausted by years of conflict. Others hesitated to return, haunted by memories of intimidation and fear. In late 1985, after the Rajneesh leadership collapsed, the remaining townspeople voted to restore the original name, Antelope. It was a quiet, symbolic gesture, reclaiming of identity after a 3-year nightmare. But the scars remained. Some buildings were abandoned, others were torn down. The community, once modest but stable, had been reshaped by forces far beyond its size. Today, Antelope has fewer than 50 residents. Many are new, unaware of the chaos that once ripped through their streets. But those who remember the early 1980s still speak softly about what they saw. They recall the sudden arrival of thousands of followers, the takeover of government positions, the hostile town meetings, the bioterror attack, the fear of speaking out, and the realization that their quiet American town had become the center of a story that would echo in documentaries, books, and investigations for decades. The Rajneesh takeover of Antelope remains one of the most dramatic examples of a cult attempting not only to control its members but to control a whole town, and then a county. It reveals how power, money, and an unchallenged leader can warp a spiritual movement into something dangerous. It shows how quickly a small community can be overwhelmed when its size makes it vulnerable. And it demonstrates, perhaps most chillingly, that even in peaceful places, the right combination of ambition and manipulation can turn neighbors into strangers and a town into a battleground. The final question that lingers is one that residents of Antelope still ask quietly. If a cult could take over their town once, what would stop another from trying again somewhere else? How many other small towns, isolated, forgotten, fall prey to people who arrive with money, confidence, and promises of paradise, only to mask a deeper hunger for control? The story of Antelope is not just about the past, it is a warning for the future. What part of this case shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments. At the turn of the 20th century, when most American towns were growing through industry, small business, and the grit of ordinary people, one town rose under a very different kind of force: absolute religious control. Zion, Illinois, began not as a community shaped by its residents, but as a meticulously engineered religious theocracy created by one man, John Alexander Dowie, who claimed the power to heal the sick, speak for God, and rule without question. What unfolded in Zion is one of the most overlooked yet astonishing true stories of a town built from the ground up under cult-like rule. A place where laws, daily life, and even personal behavior were dictated by a leader whose authority extended into every corner of human existence. The story begins in the 1890s, long before Zion existed on any map. Dowie had already established himself as a controversial religious figure in Chicago. He was a charismatic preacher, a showman, and a self-proclaimed faith healer who drew tens of thousands to his gatherings. He preached fiery sermons condemning doctors, modern medicine, alcohol, tobacco, theater, and what he called the corrupting ways of modern society. His followers, many desperate for healing or spiritual direction, fell under his influence with astonishing devotion. They believed he could cure illness with a touch or a prayer. They believed he spoke for God. They believed he was building a new spiritual kingdom. Dowie's power grew quickly. Donations poured in. Critics tried to expose him as a fraud, but his followers defended him fiercely. Emboldened, Dowie announced his most ambitious revelation yet: God had instructed him to build an entirely new city, an earthly Zion, where he and his chosen people would live according to divine law, a city free from what he believed were the evils of America, a city owned and controlled solely by him. He purchased thousands of acres of land in Lake County, Illinois, near Lake Michigan. The location was strategic, far enough from Chicago to create isolation, close enough to attract residents. This land would become the city of Zion, and every square inch of it would belong to Dowie alone. He invited followers from across the country to join him in building this holy town, promising them spiritual purity, community, healing, and eternal reward. Construction began in 1900. The city was built with religious precision: wide boulevards, community buildings, a massive tabernacle, and rows of houses carefully arranged according to plans Dowie approved personally. Every building permit required his direct approval. Every contract was signed in his name. Every business paid him rent. Home ownership was not allowed. Residents could lease houses, but Dowie retained ultimate control of the land beneath them. In essence, he owned the town and everyone in it. From the beginning, Zion was governed not by democratic laws, but by Dowie's strict personal code. He banned alcohol, tobacco, dancing, theater, modern medicine, and anything else he deemed sinful. Doctors were outlawed. Pharmacies were shut down. Even chewing gum was prohibited at one point. Newspapers printed only stories that supported him. Police officers, known as Zion Guards, were handpicked by him and enforced his rules with unwavering loyalty. Every aspect of life was monitored. Residents found themselves required to attend church services, pay tithes, follow dress codes, and accept Dowie's decisions without argument. He claimed to hear God's voice directly. To question him was to question God. Those who disobeyed were ostracized, punished, or expelled from the town entirely, with nowhere else to go and no legal property rights. Many who resisted lost everything overnight. Zion grew at a stunning pace. Within a few years, thousands of followers lived there. Businesses sprang up, all under Dowie's ownership. Industries thrived: lace factories, bakeries, printing presses, farms. Workers labored long hours, with profits directed to Dowie and his church. Financial transparency didn't exist. Followers were told that God required their sacrifices, and many gave their entire savings to him. One of Dowie's most controversial decisions was the banning of all medical treatment. He insisted that only prayer could heal illness. People suffering from infections, chronic diseases, injuries, and even childbirth complications were forbidden from seeing doctors. Many died as a result. Their deaths were described as God's will, and their families were encouraged to accept this fate with spiritual joy. Those who sought medical help outside Zion risked being exiled. At the same time, Dowie lived in luxury. He wore lavish robes, traveled internationally, and referred to himself as Elijah the Restorer, a prophet chosen by God to lead the world into a new age. He demanded total obedience and enormous donations, claiming that spiritual salvation depended on financial faith. His followers believed him. They worked harder, paid more, and sacrificed their livelihoods to support his growing empire. As Zion expanded, cracks began to form beneath the polished surface. Former members and outsiders accused Dowie of fraud and financial exploitation. Journalists began investigating his faith-healing claims, alleging that many of his miracles were staged or exaggerated. Lawsuits followed, but Dowie dismissed all criticism as persecution from enemies of God. The real trouble began when the financial structure of Zion started to collapse. The businesses Dowie established, especially Zion-laced industries, were losing money. Construction costs were enormous. Donations could no longer keep up with his spending. Yet Dowie continued to funnel money into grandiose projects, international trips, and personal luxuries. The church accumulated massive debt, all backed by the assets of the town and its residents. Still, Dowie insisted everything was fine. He proclaimed that God would provide, but God did not, and neither could his increasingly strained followers. By 1905, Zion was on the brink of financial ruin. Many residents had grown weary of Dowie's control and confused about where their money was going. Some suspected fraud. Others worried about the town's deteriorating infrastructure and growing debts. A power struggle erupted within the inner circle of church leadership. This power vacuum was seized by Wilbur Glenn Bolivar, a charismatic but ruthless figure within Dowie's organization. Bolivar accused Dowie of mismanaging funds, abusing power, and engaging in behavior unfit for a religious leader. These accusations gained traction when documents revealed that Dowie had used church money for personal luxuries, including expensive trips and exotic gifts. Followers were shocked. The man they believed was a prophet appeared to have exploited their trust for his own benefit. As the controversy escalated, Dowie suffered a stroke while in Mexico. With Dowie incapacitated, Bolivar took control. He quickly ousted Dowie from leadership, seized church assets, and declared himself the rightful leader of Zion. Many residents sided with Bolivar, believing that he would restore order and financial stability. Dowie returned to Zion to fight the takeover, but found himself powerless. His health was failing, his support fractured, and his empire crumbling. He died in 1907, penniless and disgraced, leaving behind a town he had once ruled absolutely. Under Bolivar, Zion remained a controlled religious community, though its structure evolved. Bolivar continued many of Dowie's strict policies, including the banning of medical care, cigarettes, alcohol, and modern entertainment. He also became infamous for promoting the belief in a flat earth, distributing literature throughout the town, insisting the world was flat, and denouncing modern science as a tool of Satan. Zion became known nationally as a hub for flat earth propaganda, further isolating it from mainstream American society. Yet Bolivar proved to be as financially disastrous as his predecessor. He micromanaged the town's economy, controlled wages, monitored businesses, and extracted tithes aggressively. Zion's industries continued to decline. Debt mounted once again. Residents struggled to survive under the economic strain, but leaving was difficult. Many had no savings, no assets, and no homes outside Zion. Bolivar owned nearly everything, just as Dowie had before him. By the 1930s, the Great Depression brought Zion to its knees. Factories shut down, businesses failed, families went hungry. Bolivar's grip loosened as desperation grew. Eventually, the federal government intervened, seizing assets and dissolving many aspects of the theocratic control structure. The lace factory, the financial core of the town, was taken over and operated independently. Bolivar himself died in 1942. Marking the end of the era of absolute religious rule in Zion. The town slowly reintegrated into mainstream American society. Businesses reopened under private ownership. Residents gained property rights. Churches diversified. Schools modernized. Zion transformed from a theocracy into an ordinary city with democratic governance. But the scars remained. Generations later, Zion still carries the weight of its past. Many buildings once owned by Dowie and Bolivar stand as reminders of a time when the town's residents lived under authoritarian spiritual rule. Elderly residents remember stories told by their parents or grandparents about the days when refusing to follow church law meant losing your home, your livelihood, and your community. They remember whispers about people who died from illnesses that could have been treated. They remember how children were taught that outsiders were dangerous and that questioning authority was sinful. The legacy of Zion is complicated. Some descendants of early members speak proudly of the community, recalling strong bonds and a sense of belonging. Others speak of trauma, manipulation, and lost opportunities. Historians describe Zion as one of the most striking examples of a controlled religious society in American history, a place where a charismatic leader built a city to serve his vision and used faith to maintain power long after the foundation began to crack. The haunting question of Zion's story is simple and chilling. How does a town willingly give one person total control? The answer lies in human vulnerability, the desire for community, healing, purpose, and hope. Dowie promised salvation, and people followed him into a city built on faith and surrendered freedom. By the time they realized the danger, the walls of Zion, legal, financial, and psychological, were already closed around them. Zion serves as a warning about the seductive power of certainty and the peril of giving one leader unquestioned authority. A town built to be holy became a place where people suffered in silence, obeyed without question, and trusted a man who used faith as a means of control. Its story reveals that a cult does not need to invade a town to control it. Sometimes, a cult builds the town itself. What part of this case shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments. When people talk about isolated mountain towns, they often picture quiet log cabins, ski lodges, and peaceful trails. But in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, tucked just beyond the ordinary roads and far from the noise of everyday life, There once existed a place where the silence wasn't serenity, was control. And that control came from one man, Wayne Bent. His followers called him a prophet. Prosecutors later called him something far darker. To understand how an entire American community was swallowed by the words of one self-declared Messiah, you have to go back to the late 1980s and early 1990s, when economic uncertainty, religious searching, and apocalyptic fears ran rampant through pockets of the country. People were looking for meaning, and many were vulnerable to anyone who claimed to offer answers. That vulnerability would become the foundation for what would grow into a cult that controlled not just a gathering of believers, but an entire space they considered sacred ground. Before the town shifted into something closed off and ominous, it was simply a quiet settlement near the Colorado-New Mexico border, a place where families lived in modest homes, where general stores had wooden signs, and where life was ordinary. But ordinary towns are sometimes exactly where extraordinary danger hides best. It began when a small group of religious seekers migrated into the area, drawn by rumors of a prophetic teacher whose interpretations of Scripture were unlike anything they had ever encountered. At the center of that growing gathering was Wayne Bent. To his followers, he was charismatic, calm-voiced, and spiritually awakened. In the early days, people described him as a man who seemed to radiate certainty at a time when the world felt increasingly uncertain. But certainty can be seductive, and when delivered by someone who believes his own divinity, it can become a weapon. Bent's claim was simple, shocking, and eventually destructive. He said God had spoken directly to him, instructing him to guide a chosen remnant into the final days. His group became known as the Lord Our Righteousness Church, and they were convinced that the end of the world was approaching. The members moved together, lived together, prayed together, and little by little, cut ties with the outside world entirely. When they first arrived in the small mountain region, the locals didn't know what to make of them. The group kept mostly to themselves. They bought land. They built simple structures. They avoided eye contact in town, rarely interacting with the locals except for necessary supplies. But over time, the atmosphere around them changed from peculiar to unsettling. The followers stopped coming to town at all. Supplies began to be delivered in bulk. Visitors were turned away at the gate of their compound-like community, and the man at the center Bent became more forceful about the rules his people had to obey. Inside the compound, Bent's word became law. Every decision, from relationships to daily routines to medical care, was filtered through him. He preached that the outside world was controlled by satanic forces, and that the only path to salvation was total obedience. What began as religious devotion became absolute surrender. Members turned over their property. They relinquished decisions. Parents gave him authority over their children's spiritual and physical upbringing. It didn't take long before investigators, journalists, and local residents began to speculate about what was happening inside those gates. People reported strange encounters, whispers of troubling rituals, and sightings of children who appeared thin, pale, and withdrawn. But speculation wasn't evidence, and without someone from the inside willing to speak, the authorities could do little more than watch from a distance. The turning point came when concerns about children inside the community reached law enforcement. Former members spoke of inappropriate spiritual healing sessions and troubling contact between Bent and minors. The stories grew more specific, more disturbing, and more urgent. Eventually, the accounts reached a point where the authorities had to act. New Mexico officials, working with child protection units and supported by investigators from multiple agencies, launched a formal inquiry, something that had been resisted by the cult for years. The group denied everything, calling the investigation a government attack on God's chosen people. But the legal system didn't turn away. Once the allegations were thoroughly examined, the case moved forward. Bent was arrested and later tried on charges related to the inappropriate touching of minors, charges he insisted were false, claiming that God had instructed him to carry out certain spiritual acts that he said were non-sexual. But prosecutors saw something else entirely. They saw a man who used divine authority as a tool for exploitation, and they presented their case accordingly. The courtroom was a stark contrast to the compound. There was no chanting, no dim candlelight, no prophetic declarations, just facts, testimony, and the weight of the law. Testimony from former members described rituals where Bent claimed that physical contact was an act of spiritual cleansing. For the jurors, the emotional impact of hearing children describe those moments was devastating. During trial coverage, outlets like ABC News and other major networks reported every detail. Outside the courthouse, locals expressed anger, sadness, and shock that something so dark had been happening so close to home. Some felt guilty for not intervening sooner. Others felt relief that someone had finally pierced the silence surrounding that isolated settlement. Bent was ultimately convicted and sentenced to prison. To this day, he maintains his innocence. His followers, what remains of them, continue to believe he was persecuted for his faith, not his actions. But the legal outcome was clear. The court believed the victims. Even after the conviction, the compound didn't dissolve immediately. Some members stayed behind, clinging to the teachings even as their prophet sat behind bars. The land remained eerily quiet. Homes were left in place. Prayer halls stood empty. The once strict, all-consuming environment became a ghost of its former self, abandoned by many and feared by neighboring communities. The aftermath extended far beyond the courtroom. Families torn apart by the cult struggled to rebuild their lives. Children who had grown up isolated from the world faced the overwhelming task of learning how to navigate ordinary society. Former members wrestled with guilt, trauma, and the psychological scars of long-term manipulation. Communities nearby worked to heal from the shock of having something so sinister develop practically in their backyard. Journalists, psychologists, and cult deprogramming experts studied the case for years, citing it as a key example of how charismatic authority, isolation, and apocalyptic fear can warp an entire community. It's one of the most disturbing instances in recent American history where a secluded town-like settlement fell entirely under the control of a single self-proclaimed prophet. Yet the reflection that lingers isn't just about the man who led it. It's about the people who followed, the gradual erosion of independence, and the frightening ease with which a group seeking spiritual fulfillment can slide into something far more dangerous. The most chilling question is the one experts continue to ask. If a small mountain settlement in the United States could be transformed into a closed-off world, ruled by one man's delusions, how many other quiet towns, isolated, overlooked, and under-examined, might already be teetering on the same edge? And what would it take for someone to notice before it's too late? What part of this case shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments. Long before the nation learned its name, the small town of Arlington, Washington seemed like any other quiet community in the Pacific Northwest. Fog drifted over cedar rooftops in the mornings, evergreen forests pressed close to the narrow streets, and families lived the kind of life that never makes the news. But in the late 1990s and early 2000s, this peaceful town became the center of something far darker, because a man named Edgar Eugene Pierce arrived with promises of spiritual growth, personal transformation, and a new path to enlightenment. What he created instead was control, exploitation, and fear. And for years, Arlington became known not for its forests, but for the cult that quietly took over the town. To understand how it happened, you have to picture the environment at the time. Arlington was small, with long stretches of farmland, modest neighborhoods, and logging roads that wound deep into the woods. People trusted their neighbors. Church doors stayed unlocked. Kids rode bikes along gravel roads without anyone worrying. It was the kind of place where charm masked vulnerability, because a town that trusts easily can be manipulated easily. When Edgar Eugene Pierce first appeared, he did not come as a prophet or preacher. He came as a teacher of a self-help movement, a life system he promised would free people from emotional pain. He presented himself as calm, insightful, and deeply intelligent, a man who said he understood the patterns of human suffering better than any therapist or spiritual leader. He claimed he could help people transcend fear, guilt, and insecurity. And people listened. Pierce founded a group he called the Self-Understanding Fellowships, something that sounded harmless, modern, and safe. But behind the branding was a structure of control that would grow into a full-fledged cult. He rented buildings around Arlington, including homes and meeting halls, and filled them with people eager for guidance. He promised breakthroughs, emotional healing, and enlightenment. What he delivered instead was a doctrine that subtly broke down free will. What made Arlington so vulnerable was the timing. Many residents were dealing with layoffs, family struggles, or personal crises. When a man arrived offering purpose and certainty, it felt like hope. Pierce spoke about inner cleansing, emotional rebirth, and the idea that negative thoughts had to be purged through absolute discipline. The more people attended his workshops, the more they became convinced that he held answers no one else did. They invited friends, they brought their families, and within months, the fellowship grew rapidly. People left their jobs, some sold their homes and moved into properties controlled by the group. Others gave Pierce access to their finances, believing he would help them reach a higher state of being. He didn't ask all at once, he asked gradually, little by little, the way most cult leaders do. First, it was emotional reliance, then spiritual, then financial, then complete control. Arlington residents began to notice changes. The self-understanding fellowship expanded faster than seemed normal. Followers moved in clusters, rarely speaking to outsiders. Homes associated with the group had dark curtains and blocked-off windows. Cars with the same strange bumper sticker began appearing around town. In grocery stores, members displayed an eerie politeness, calm, quiet, and emotionless, like they had been trained to suppress natural reactions. The fellowship's meeting hall, once a simple rental building, transformed into a guarded space with strict access rules. Members were expected to attend multiple sessions a week. Pierce framed these gatherings as cleansing cycles, during which followers were expected to confess personal secrets, express vulnerabilities, and allow him to strip away the false self. He recorded many of these sessions. He stored them in boxes, and those recordings would become powerful tools of manipulation. Pierce separated families. He told followers their loved ones were holding them back spiritually. Parents were pressured to let the fellowship raise their children during critical developmental stages. Some gave in. Kids who grew up in the group later described the experience as living in a world where fear and obedience defined every day. They had little contact with outsiders. Their schooling was minimal. Their diet was restricted. Their sleep was monitored. They were told that the outside world would corrupt them, that only Pierce's teachings could protect them. This lifestyle began spilling into Arlington in ways people couldn't ignore. Local teachers noticed children from fellowship families were withdrawn and overly anxious. Some were terrified to speak in class. Medical workers treating members reported that they seemed rehearsed, answering questions in scripted tones. But without a crime, no authority could intervene. Pierce's grip grew stronger. He demanded that members surrender more money. He encouraged fighters from within the group to monitor one another, and he insisted that anyone expressing doubt undergo corrective sessions, which often meant hours of verbal humiliation. Many who tried to leave were threatened with being cut off from their families, their money, and their supposed chance at spiritual freedom. By the early 2000s, Arlington locals began reporting disturbing encounters, members who mistreated their children publicly, late-night chanting sessions, and groups standing motionless in fields as if waiting for instructions. Rumors spread of violence within the fellowship, punishments carried out under the guise of spiritual correction. It reached a point where parents wouldn't let their children walk alone near fellowship-owned homes. The turning point came when a former member escaped the group and reported abuse to law enforcement. This ex-member described Pierce as a man who thrived on control, using fear to dominate his followers while enriching himself financially. The informant talked about forced labor, emotional torment, sleep deprivation, and punishments that left lasting trauma. Investigators were finally able to justify a deeper look. Working with state authorities and the FBI, the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office began surveillance of the fellowship's properties. They observed strange patterns: members working outdoors late at night, children being escorted by multiple adults, and large cash transfers into accounts Pierce controlled. But the real breakthrough came when investigators obtained some of the recordings. Pierce had kept the so-called cleansing sessions. In those recordings, they heard Pierce berating followers, using psychological pressure to force compliance. The recordings painted a picture of someone wielding spiritual authority like a weapon. When law enforcement moved in, the operation was swift. Armed with warrants, they raided multiple fellowship properties. Followers tried to prevent entry, but the law prevailed. Inside, investigators found evidence of coercion, financial exploitation, and documents detailing Pierce's internal rules for punishing members. They also discovered that many members had turned over their homes, bank accounts, and personal possessions to him. Pierce was arrested and charged with multiple counts, including fraud, financial exploitation, and abuse. During his trial, prosecutors argued that he wasn't a spiritual guide, he was running a criminal enterprise disguised as a religious movement. The courtroom became the stage where Arlington finally learned what had really been happening behind the fellowship's doors. Some of the most powerful testimony came from former members who described how Pierce convinced them they were spiritually worthless without him. They talked about emotional manipulation, threats of divine punishment, and the group's harsh internal structure. One witness described nights where children were forced to stand in silence for hours as punishment for minor misbehavior. Another spoke about being denied access to food and sleep as part of cleansing. Pierce's defense team attempted to portray him as a misunderstood spiritual teacher, but the evidence told a different story. Financial records showed he had funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars from members into his personal accounts. The recordings revealed psychological domination, and physical punishments described by witnesses matched documented injuries found by investigators. Local coverage from the Seattle Times and other Washington outlets kept the public informed. Arlington residents reacted with a mix of shock and anger. Many had suspected something was wrong, but few realized the depth of control Pierce had over the group. The trial ended with Pierce being convicted. He was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, and the self-understanding fellowship collapsed almost immediately afterward. Some members fled the state. Others sought help from counselors and cult recovery organizations. Some struggled to adjust to life outside the group, overwhelmed by a world they had been told to fear. In the aftermath, Arlington tried to return to normal, but the memory of the fellowship lingered for years. Houses once controlled by the group remained empty, their windows boarded or dark. Overgrown yards stood as reminders of the cult's presence. Families torn apart by Pierce's influence worked slowly to reconcile. Children who grew up inside the group had to relearn everything about ordinary life, from how to socialize to how to trust. Experts in cult psychology later studied the case, pointing to Pierce's manipulation as a classic example of coercive control. He isolated his followers, broke down their identities, and rebuilt them in service to himself. Arlington's story became a warning often cited in lectures and research papers about how self-help movements can evolve into something far more dangerous. But what remains most haunting is the question people in Arlington still ask privately: how did this happen here? How did a quiet, friendly town become a place where a cult leader gained unchecked control over dozens of lives? And how many people suffered in silence while the rest of the town went about its everyday routines? The truth is unsettling. Cults don't need remote deserts or hidden compounds. They don't always look like radical fringe groups. Sometimes, all they need is a man selling hope, a town that trusts too easily, and a handful of people desperate for answers. Arlington may have returned to peace, but its story stands as a chilling reminder. Even the safest places can fall under the shadow of someone who knows how to twist belief into obedience. What part of this case shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments. In the mountains of Colorado, there is a long, uneasy memory, one tied to a cult that quietly reshaped an entire community. Long before investigators uncovered the truth, residents in the remote region of Costilla County noticed strangers moving into isolated properties in large groups, following strict routines, reciting prayers at rigid hours, and treating one man as a divine authority. The man at the center of it was Wayne Bent, the leader of a doomsday movement that spilled across state lines and cast a shadow over multiple small towns in Colorado and New Mexico. Most people know him from the compound in New Mexico, but years earlier, the group's roots extended into rural Colorado communities, places where isolation offered the perfect ground for control. To understand how the influence spread into Colorado, you must imagine the terrain: vast open land at high altitude, long stretches of dirt roads, small clusters of homes standing miles apart, and winters so harsh that neighbors sometimes didn't see each other for months. Places like Fort Garland and San Luis were quiet and slow, shaped by generations of families living off the land. When outsiders came with spiritual language and apocalyptic warnings, they didn't immediately raise suspicion. People in the region minded their own business, reluctant to intrude on others' beliefs. That silence allowed Bent's movement, known as the Lord Our Righteousness Church, to take root. Bent first gained influence in the 1980s and 1990s. Through radio sermons and religious conferences, he portrayed himself as a prophetic figure, someone chosen by God to deliver a final message before the end times. He spoke softly, with conviction and an air of certainty that drew vulnerable listeners in. Among them were people dealing with economic hardship, fractured families, or spiritual confusion. Bent promised clarity, he promised answers, and eventually, he promised salvation, but only through obedience to him. Over time, several families left their homes and followed Bent toward what he called the place of preparation. a region where believers should gather before the world descended into chaos. Some relocated to New Mexico, but many passed first through Colorado, buying or renting rural land in Costilla County. These families arrived quietly, often selling their possessions, withdrawing their children from school, and dedicating everything to Bent's interpretations of Scripture. They formed small clusters of homes that operated as unofficial extensions of the main group. Bent preached doctrines centered around purity, end-times judgment, and spiritual transformation. He declared that conventional churches were corrupt, that the government was an instrument of darkness, and that he alone spoke God's law. Followers accepted this without question, reinforcing each other's belief that leaving Bent's orbit meant eternal punishment. Slowly, this ideology began shaping daily life in the Colorado communities associated with the group. Neighbors noticed that the new families rarely interacted with outsiders. Their children were schooled at home, with heavy emphasis on Bent's teachings. Adults gathered in private homes for what they called spiritual rest sessions, where Bent's recorded messages were played repeatedly. These sessions were the glue that held the group together. They were emotional, intense, and often involved confessions, tears, and declarations of loyalty to Bent's mission. Over time, an invisible border formed between members and non-members. Locals described seeing children who seemed fearful to speak, families who refused medical care, and adults who avoided eye contact. On some properties, makeshift structures appeared, small buildings that looked like meeting halls or communal gathering places. Members farmed together, prayed together, and maintained a rigid schedule. Everything they did was structured around Bent's directives. The most troubling sign was the way Bent isolated his followers from the world. He convinced them that society was collapsing morally and spiritually, and that only those who withdrew into his guidance would survive divine judgment. Families sold businesses, abandoned careers, and cut ties with relatives. Property records later revealed that some followers transferred ownership of their land or homes to entities associated with the group. Rumors spread in surrounding Colorado towns about unusual nighttime gatherings, singing, chanting, lights burning until dawn. People whispered about strict purity rituals and about Bent's disturbing significance within the group, particularly his interactions with young women. But the rumors remained rumors, never crossing into official reports, because no one outside the group had direct evidence. People in small towns tend to avoid confrontation, and with the properties dispersed across rural land, much of what happened remained hidden. This quiet period ended when troubling information emerged from a former member who had fled the group. They told authorities about bizarre theological practices, emotional coercion, and disturbing relationships between Bent and certain followers. Their account caught the attention of investigative reporters, including those from the Denver Post, who began digging into the group's presence both in Colorado and New Mexico. The reporters found a pattern: families who vanished from their former communities, properties purchased in remote regions, and children living in conditions shaped entirely by Bent's apocalyptic worldview. Authorities in Colorado began quietly gathering information, but because many of the alleged abuses were happening across the state line in New Mexico, jurisdiction became complicated. Still, the investigations revealed that multiple families in Costilla County were deeply entangled in Bent's control. They followed his directives regarding marriage, children, finances, and property decisions. Some members later testified that even major life choices such as medical care, moving, or contacting relatives required Bent's approval. As scrutiny increased, Bent became bolder. He spoke publicly in online videos, claiming he had been chosen for a divine purpose. He insisted that the government was persecuting him and said his followers must stand firm. In some of these videos, his voice trembled in ways that suggested he believed his own narrative, a phenomenon experts later described as a fusion of narcissism and delusion. Eventually, New Mexico authorities obtained enough evidence to execute a raid on the group's main compound, former ranch near the Colorado border where several followers from the Colorado satellite communities were living or visiting. The raid uncovered disturbing information. Investigators learned of inappropriate behaviors carried out under the guise of spiritual healing. They heard accounts from minors who described interactions with Bent that were deeply unsettling. They documented the structure of control, confessions, isolation, spiritual manipulation, and psychological pressure. Bent was arrested and charged with several offenses, including contributing to the delinquency of minors. His trial became nationally watched. The courtroom atmosphere was tense. Followers sat silently, their faces expressionless, convinced their prophet was being crucified by a corrupt world. Former members, in contrast, testified with trembling voices, describing how Bent convinced them that divine transformation required surrendering their autonomy, and in some cases, their boundaries. During the trial, prosecutors presented recordings and written materials that revealed Bent's escalating sense of messianic identity. They showed how he claimed God commanded him to engage in acts he framed as symbolic purity rituals. They detailed the isolation of children, the pressure placed on adults to relinquish their free will, and the intricate system of control he maintained over his scattered communities, including those in Colorado. The jury found Bent guilty. He was sentenced to prison, where he remained a defiant figure, insisting he had been persecuted for obeying God. After his imprisonment, the movement fractured. Some followers abandoned the group entirely. Others tried to keep it alive, though without Bent's presence, their cohesion quickly deteriorated. Properties in Colorado once associated with the group were sold or left empty, their windows boarded, their yards overgrown. In the aftermath, Colorado communities that had been touched by the cult struggled with mixed emotions. Some felt relief, others were unsettled by how quietly the group had operated in their midst. Towns like Fort Garland and San Luis became subjects of documentaries and articles about the dangers of isolated communities falling under the sway of charismatic leaders. Local officials began hosting training sessions on recognizing signs of coercive control and religious extremism. Counselors specializing in cult recovery worked with former members who had returned to Colorado, helping them rebuild lives defined by choice rather than doctrine. The story raised difficult questions. How could such a movement establish roots in modern America? Why had no one intervened earlier? Experts pointed to the geography-isolated rural, with minimal oversight. They pointed to psychology-vulnerable individuals drawn to a leader who promised certainty. And they pointed to society's reluctance to challenge religious movements, even when red flags appear. In the end, what haunts many is the simplicity of it. Bent did not build a massive army or a global network. He built influence in small communities by offering answers people were desperate to hear. He created a system where doubt was a sin, obedience was salvation, and leaving meant losing everything. Colorado's involvement in the story is a reminder that cults do not always take over entire cities. They can infiltrate just enough to leave lasting scars. Today, the homes once used by the group stand as silent reminders. Some have been renovated by new owners unaware of their past. Others sit abandoned, slowly collapsing into the earth. And in the memories of those who lived through it, the shadow of Bent's influence lingers. What happened there is not forgotten, because it shows how easily a community even once surrounded by mountains, beauty, and peace can fall under the control of someone who knows how to twist faith into bondage. Which of these cases shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments. For more real-life crime stories, subscribe and stay tuned for the next deep dive.